Welcome to the channel for you. Measure and concept of development. Development can be measured by economic or human factors. Developing countries are, in general, countries that have not achieved a significant degree of industrialization relative to their populations, and have, in most cases, a medium to low standard of living. There is an association between low income and high population growth. The development of a country is measured with statistical indices such as income per capita per person, gross domestic product per capita, life expectancy, the rate of literacy, freedom index and others. The UN has developed the Human Development Index (HDI), a compound indicator of some of the above statistics, to gauge the level of human development for countries where data is available. The UN had set Millennium Development Goals from a blueprint developed by all of the world's countries and leading development institutions, in order to evaluate growth. These goals ended in 2015, to be superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals. The concept of the developing nation is found, under one term or another, in numerous theoretical systems having diverse orientations, for example, theories of decolonization, liberation theology, Marxism, anti-imperialism, modernization, social change and political economy. Another important indicator is the sectoral changes that have occurred since the stage of development of the country. On an average, countries with a 50% contribution from the secondary sector, manufacturing, have grown substantially. Similarly, countries with a tertiary sector stronghold also see a greater rate of economic development. Criticisms and related terms. There is criticism for using the term developing country. The term could imply inferiority of this kind of country compared with a developed country. It could assume a desire to develop along the traditional Western model of economic development which a few countries, such as Cuba and Bhutan, choose not to follow. Alternative measurements such as gross national happiness have been suggested as important indicators. World's regions by total wealth, in trillions USD, 2018. One of the early criticism that questioned the use of the terms developing and underdeveloped countries was voiced in 1973 by prominent historian and academic Walter Rodney, who compared the economic, social and political parameters between the United States and countries in Africa and Asia. There is no established convention for defining developing country. According to economist and sustainable development expert Jeffrey Sachs, the current divide between the developed and developing world is largely a phenomenon of the 20th century. The late global health expert Hans Rosling has argued against the terms, calling the concept outdated since the terms are used under the prerequisite that the world is divided in rich and poor countries, while the fact is that the vast majority of countries are middle income. The term, developing, describes a currently observed situation and not a changing dynamic or expected progress direction. Since the late 1990s, developing countries tended to demonstrate higher growth rates than developed countries. To moderate the euphemistic aspect of the word, developing, international organizations have started to use the term less economically developed country for the poorest nations, which can, in no sense, be regarded as developing. This highlights that the standard of living across the entire developing world varies greatly. In 2015, the World Bank declared that the developed world categorization is becoming less relevant, due to worldwide improvements in indices such as child mortality rates, fertility rates and extreme poverty rates. In the 2016 edition of its World Development Indicators, the World Bank made a decision to no longer distinguish between developed and developing countries in the presentation of its data, considering the two-category distinction outdated. Accordingly, World Bank is phasing out use of that descriptor. Instead, the reports by World Bank, such as the World Development Indicators (WDI) and the Global Monitoring Report, now include data aggregations for the whole world, for regions, and for income groups, but not for the developing world. Third World. Over the past few decades since the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the term Third World has been used interchangeably with developing countries, but the concept has become outdated in recent years as it no longer represents the current political or economic state of the world. The three-world model arose during the Cold War to define countries aligned with NATO, the First World, the Communist Bloc, the Second World, although this term was less used, or neither, the Third World. Strictly speaking, Third World was a political, rather than an economic, grouping. Global South. The term Global South began to be used more widely since about 2004. It can also include poorer, southern regions of wealthy, northern countries. The Global South refers to these countries' interconnected histories of colonialism, neo-imperialism, and differential economic and social change through which large inequalities in living standards, life expectancy, and access to resources are maintained. Associated theories. The term developing countries has many research theories associated with it, in chronological order. Modernization theory, to explain the process of modernization within societies. Dependency theory, the notion that resources flow from a periphery of poor and underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former. Development theory, a collection of theories about how desirable change in society is best achieved. Post-development theory holds that the whole concept and practice of development is a reflection of Western northern hegemony over the rest of the world. Common characteristics. Government, politics and administration. Many developing countries have only attained full self-determination and democracy after the second half of the 20th century. Many were governed by an imperial European power until decolonization. Political systems in developing countries are diverse, but most states had established some form of democratic governments by the early 21st century, with varying degrees of success and political liberty. The inhabitants of developing countries were introduced to democratic systems later and more abruptly than their northern counterparts and were sometimes targeted by governmental and non-governmental efforts to encourage participation. Effective citizenship is defined by sociologist Patrick Heller as closing gap between formal legal rights in the civil and political arena, and the actual capability to meaningfully practice those rights. Beyond citizenship, the study of the politics of cross-border mobility in developing countries has also shed valuable light in migration debates, seen as a corrective to the traditional focus on developed countries. Some political scientists identify a typology of nationalizing, developmental, and neoliberal migration management regimes across developing countries.